right, welcome everyone and good morning. Good afternoon to us here in Australia. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Beck Pierce today. She works at the intersection of social theory and political economy, and her teaching and research focuses on environmental inequalities, policy, and social change. So Beck's current projects focus on the rapid and just energy transition with particular focus on land and labor relations. I think that this session today is going to be very, very interesting for everyone. And without further ado, let me hand you over to Beck.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, and hello to you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So my task is to talk about energy transition as an industrial transformation and to bring up questions for us to reflect on with regard to labour, the work involved in producing renewable energy commodities and other alternate infrastructures that are needed as we move away from fossil fuels to a low carbon economy on a global level. Most of what I'm going to speak about comes from my research in Australia, but I'm really looking forward to learning from you and hearing about what resonates and where the issues for you depart from the experience I'm going to share with you today. Before I move on, I also want to recognise that I'm presenting today on the sovereign lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, Australia, and recognise and celebrate their traditional custodianship and that there's a lot of business to do still in reconciling with First Nations people of this continent. This is our agenda for the next 2 hours. So the first 20 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce the idea that energy transition is a labour issue, and we're going to discuss different ways to think about labour to get us going, really, because I want to propose that questions about labour actually provide a window into some of the main inequalities that get debated when it comes to making the transitions between one fuel source and another, particularly decarbonisation to renewable energy. Then I'm going to give you some more material on where the literature and policy discussion seems to be in terms of best practice to deal with labour-related inequalities. We'll have a break. And I'll come back and share a couple of examples from Australia in terms of where the lessons are being documented here. And then in the final 25 minutes or so, I really like for us to have a quite open discussion about where you see these issues in your locations and the extent to which you see commonalities and differences so we can learn from one another. So let's kick off. The idea of energy transition being a labour issue. You've certainly heard some very important information already about the technological changes ahead. We're moving in Australia, for instance, but all over the world from energy systems that tend to focus on centralised power stations like this one on the left. This is a coal-fired power plant, to a much more distributed energy system, albeit with some really big utilities like these solar panels on rural land at the top and that large field of wind turbines at the bottom. So it's a technological change, but it also has a very important social geography. It's changing the work of energy production and circulation. Whereas we think of workers in energy, we almost singularly think of workers producing fuels in the form of coal, oil or gas, or perhaps uranium. And obviously we think of centralized power station workers as well. But now we're looking at an energy workforce that of course does still involve extractive materials and new materials like rare metals, cobalt, and so on. But we're also talking about enrolling new manufacturing sectors for what is often called big box construction of solar panels on roofs and solar farms, as well as wind farms. So there's a big shift in work going on amidst this technological shift. That is the kind of social story I want to focus in on behind that technological fuel switch, as it were, represented here by the expanded share of renewable energy globally. This is a graph that represents that fuel switch where I'm from. I'm going to speak a little to a case study later on about what this fuel switch looks like in the place that I've been studying in a research team. This is an estimate of the fuel switch in the state of New South Wales. It's on the eastern seaboard of Australia. It's one of the largest states. It's home to Sydney, a place you've probably heard of, potentially also been. We're looking at the closure of 4 coal-fired power plants in that state, and a major expansion of utility scale wind and solar. These estimates are from calculations a team and I did, looking at the planning system for that state, looking at what was being proposed for the state government to approve. We've also been looking at the new infrastructure being developed by the Australian energy market operator, building out the grid into rural Australia. And this is the other important thing. There is a rural spatial shift going on in this place where I'm looking at energy transition, and in many other places. So looking at our calculations again by geography, we can see those black bars on the left representing the current installed capacity of the coal-fired power plants in the Hunter Valley, an area of New South Wales that hosts many coal mines as well as coal-fired power plants, and one coal-fired power plant in the Central West in a place called Lithgow. But all the new capacity in wind and solar proposed in our, or already constructed through our planning system, is going into new areas of the state. This is an image of 3 key areas of renewable energy development that my colleagues and I have been studying, called renewable energy zones. We have spent a number of trips in the first New England renewable energy zone at the top, and the second very large Central West renewable energy zone. These are entirely different places to where the coal-fired power is. We're looking at new infrastructure moving into these areas, bringing new commerce, bringing new work, as well as related debates that we can talk about as we go along. But today we're going to look at a particular dimension of this new social geography to energy, which is the labour issues that come up when we move our technology from one place to another, from one way of doing energy work to another. There are issues of inequality and fairness that centre on the labour question. And this is how we get to discussions internationally about a just transition, being fair about the way we move people and infrastructure in energy as the transition unfolds. Now, I imagine this is a pretty familiar term to the group, the idea of a just transition. Can I ask for volunteers to reflect on what a just transition means to you in your observations and experience? Perhaps you want to reflect on what it is and who needs it. That'd be good as we get our session started off. So I'll give you a little bit of time and ask you, Tariq, to help me hear from people.
And feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak, or if you would like to type into the chat box, that's also possible. So, okay, great. We've got a couple of answers coming in the chat box. A colleague from Vietnam says, just transition is a process that is fair to everyone included.
That's great.
And follow-on comment is that for energy, the focus from this Vietnamese colleague is the coal workers.
Yes, so I think that's a shrewd observation. Trung, how do I pronounce? Trung?
Yeah, Trung.
Trung.
I think it's
the concept of just transition, particularly when it was first circulated in North America, the focus was definitely on impacted workers in coal-fired power stations, and as well as coal mines. I think that's a really important observation about the history of this term.
There's also for Indonesian colleagues online, where there's lots of coal as well. It'd be interesting to hear from Indonesian colleagues if the just transition is also discussed in terms of coal in Indonesia. Okay, we've got another from Joseph from the Philippines. Just transition calls for inclusivity and fairness, especially for the vulnerable and marginalized sectors. So.
Yeah, so it's not just about who gets what, but it's also about how decisions are made and who's included in the discussion about shifting how we produce energy. Absolutely, this issue of inclusivity and fairness is core. If I'm right, you haven't met Beck Colvin yet, is that right? That's next week?
Yes, correct, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to borrow a couple of her slides that you'll sort of broaden out into in discussion with her next week. She's going to offer the broad concept of energy justice, which is picking up on what you've already offered in some significant ways. It's about making energy available for people, making it affordable, having due process for making decisions about where energy is sited and who's involved and who benefits, governing well, sharing information and being transparent, making sure that energy resources don't create social or environmental harms, pollution and so on, paying attention to both intragenerational equity, so what's fair between different groups affected by energy transition, as well as intergenerational equity, that energy shouldn't disadvantage future generations, making sure that responsibility is shared fairly, those most able to pay the costs and bear the burden should move first internationally as well as within our societies. And there are also other principles of being able to actively oppose and have your say if you're unhappy, and to happy with an energy development, and attention to different constituencies and different social identities people have. Now, this is a very broad social understanding of justice in energy transition. You're going to move to that broader discussion. Today, we're going to focus on the Labor perspective within that, okay? We're always going to be talking about the bigger issues in some respect, but I want to hone in from here on what it is to be contributing to this energy justice concept or just transition when Labor issues are your focus. So in some respects, a Labor perspective is about asking who's doing the work involved in energy production and circulation during this time of transition. Okay, so it's asking what groups of people are involved in terms of the labour necessary to produce energy. There are lots of different ways to think about this, answering this question. I'm going to propose 4 main perspectives on labour. And then I'm going to, when I've finished, I'm going to ask you to reflect on which perspectives make the most sense to you. So the first way of thinking about energy as a labour issue is economic. Labour is a cost for producers of energy. It's something that has to be paid for instance, by firms that undertake the mining of coal in Indonesia and other parts of the region you're working in. So it's a core part of the economics of energy and the economics of transition as well. Another way to think about it, think about labour, is in terms of our institutions. So an institution is basically our way of socially organising patterns of work. In this instance, if you work for a medium-sized or potentially large firm or public institution, there'll be a human resources department, someone who's involved in engaging you in terms of your contract for employment. You might also have your labour dealt with by superordinate bodies like the International Labour Organization, or there might be a national body like our Fair Work Commission that deals with labour issues on the national level. So labour is part of our social institutions. It's also part of our informal institutions. Most households rely on work that's done outside of the wage relationship, but is necessary for the household's economics. So we can think about labour in institutional terms. What's normal for employment is governed by these institutions. We can also think about labour in terms of segmentation. Not all labour is the same. We live in a very complex society. Our industries are very complex and we need to specialise in different types of work. So the chart on the right shows an estimate of the employment associated with renewable energy in Australia. And you can see that there are lots of different types of jobs, ways to define different types of jobs. They can be defined in terms of the fuel type being worked on, coal versus wind, solar PV and so on. There are also types of jobs that can be defined in terms of whether they're about operating energy utilities, working in the coal-fired power plant, or constructing energy facilities like installing a solar panels on a roof or on a large solar farm. So there are different ways to divide up our thinking about energy labour, and we could also extend this thinking to that unpaid labour involving energy at the household level. That's another segment. We have formal energy work, doing different types of operation and construction labour. And then we have all this unpaid energy work, particularly in areas, rural areas. There's a lot of work going into the household provisioning of energy for cooking and warmth and so on. So this way of thinking about labour focuses on the segmentation, the divisions of labour between people involved in producing and circulating energy. And finally, we can think about labour in terms of its politics. The most common way for labour to be represented politically, particularly in established stationary energy sectors like fossil fuel mining and centralised power generation, is through trade unions. I would imagine most nations you're working in have trade union bodies that propose to represent the political and economic interests of labour as a group. And they organise in terms of profession or industry. In Australia, for instance, there's a union to represent university workers. There's also a union to represent public sector workers and electrical trades workers and mining and construction workers. They're all different trade unions raising general labour issues as well as specific issues to advocate for fair employment, better institutions and good conditions in terms of labour. So that's the four ways of thinking about labour. One, in terms of the hard economics of labour. Second, in terms of the divisions of labour. Third, in terms of how labour is regulated in terms of our institutions. And fourth, in terms of the politics of labour, the representation of labour politically through things like trade unions or other groups that, for instance, might raise migrant worker issues that aren't exactly trade unions, they're something else. So which of these ways of thinking about labour make most sense to you is my question. The economic version, the institutional version, the segmentation version, or the political version? Any responses to these four ways of thinking about labour?
Anybody got their hand raised? Or you could type into the chat which of those four make most sense or that you relate to. Has anyone heard of labour being discussed in these four ways before, or one of the four ways before? While we've got one hand raised, Mr. Chin.
Tôi có một cái trao đổi có vấn đề liên quan.
Yeah, I would like to discuss with you this point. You know that in Vietnam, so when for the energy transition, we want to reduce the coal thermal power production in Quảng Ninh. So we also think about just transition. That means the impact on the coal mining and the coal thermal power workers. So when we shift to the renewable energy such as wind power or solar PV. So besides the economic value from the transitions, we also need to look at the economic impact and also the social impact on the workers. Therefore, in Vietnam, we are thinking of, for example, if we reduce the share of the coal thermal, so how about the shift of labor? So what the workers can do after the energy shift. In Quảng Ninh, you know, the Quảng Ninh province is one province in Vietnam. They are shifting to the greener economic development, and they are more reliant on tourism development, and also to make sure that the workers can shift to other professions, that they can still make ends meet. And we can improve the plateau effect in economic model. That means that with the energy transition and with the energy shift and the employment shift, people still can benefit from this. So when I agree with what you presented, so when we shift to renewable energies, besides looking at the economic effect, we really need to look at the impact on the workers, what they can do after the shift, and some of them may shift to other professions, for example, to work as a worker for PV solar, for the solar PV projects. It depends on the projects that are constructed in their localities. And initially, I think that what we will be doing in Quảng Ninh sounds okay for the workers. Yeah, so the transition is really the very big things to think about. And we should not go in a hurry. We really need to take the stepwise approach. Yeah. You know that the solar PV and the wind power farms may require the different sets of the skills and require the different categories of workers. I very much would like to learn from experience of Australia. I myself also visited Australia for some times, and there I know that you have gold minings, and you have other minings. And Quảng Ninh province in Vietnam, they also shift to the more sustainable and green economic development. So how can they turn the already closed coal mines to the tourist sites? You can learn a lot from Melbourne in Australia. Yeah, and also some of the open coal mines can, after being closed, they can serve as a reservoir, and also doing some kind of the recovery activities to develop into the very good landscape there. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments. I heard the second half, but not the first half. I apologize. But what I did hear was that it's important to think about the economic effects of transition, but also the social impact on workers who might not have skills and professional experience that matches the industry coming into our energy systems. They might
Exactly. Okay. Right. Because from Vietnamese experience, we change from coal mining and now to green growth. So we will reduce.
Oops, you're muted.
Okay, my mic have problem. So again, I agree with you. You understand me because I explain more. Okay, you continue. Thank you.
Tarek, I can't hear you.
Having problems. Well, I think Beck.
Yes.
Sorry, Beck. I think
Yeah, and hello.
Tarek's mic has some problem. I will unmute Mr. Thắng. He is raising his hand right now.
Thank you.
Hello, I also want to talk about the same experience that Mr. Ching has said before, but it's in a little bit larger. I mean that when have the energy transition to the renewable energy, that will be moving of the human resource from the traditional one like the thermal power plant or the hydropower plant to area where have lot of the solar or wind, because for the thermal or the hydropower plant, they will located in near the source of energy or near the coal mining. But for the renewable energy, it will be different location, depend on the geography and the condition of the weather. But the problem in here, it will be the lack of the, because it will take time to training for people who work for the traditional one. But right now, when the new one, they could move because they said that it's near their hometown, and also the workload, they said that it's more lighter with different technology. Is the first one when lack of the human resources and take the long time for training. So secondly, as the Mr. Ching said, for the traditional one, the operation of the plan it based on, I mean, it doesn't have many variable coming, but for the renewable energy, it can affect a lot of the renewable, the trend in the input. So it requires more skill related to the big data or the machine learning skill for them to work for the operation. But I'm not seeing that in the presentation you mentioned about the capacity training for the human resources to deal with, come up with the new requirement in the technology to deal with the operation. That what I want to hearing more from you, the experience for the like the capital file like that, and also the rate capacity to deal with the operation of the RE in the way in moving to energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Tang. This is a very important point, that our capacity to do work in new industries requires skills. Some of them, those skills already exist out there in our workforces, but some of them don't. And as you say, it takes time to develop the training and education institutions needed to help get people into the skills needed for a new industry like this. And it's part of the debate about shifting from coal and other fossil fuels to renewables as well, because those workers have different skills and different employment and education histories to many of the renewable energy workers. I'm going to move on and pick up some more of what you've said in the rest of the presentation. To close off on the different ways that we might think about labour, I wanted to propose that any one narrow view of the labour issues surrounding energy transition isn't going to get all of the capture all of the problems and possibilities in energy transition. It's better to think about labour with multiple dimensions, including the social question of where people's skills come from. Our capacity to do work is something that we sell in labour markets, but it's also something that's in us. We learn how to work in our families, in our primary and high schools, perhaps at university as well. Turning that capacity to do work into a commodity involves lots of social regulation. There's a lot going on in the production of a worker, an individual who works. And thinking about labour markets, there's a useful book on the social regulation of labour that talks through the general issues of bringing workers into labour markets, giving them contracts and negotiating fair pay. Also making decisions on a national level, on a regional level, about how workers can connect their skills to the opportunities available. There are also institutions involved in controlling the labour process, deciding who's going to do the construction work, who's going to do the office work, on what hours, who's going to do the technical work of engineering and waste management and more. And all of this needs to be produced over time. We produce our capacity to do work through our families and so on. So it's a commodity, it's a set of skills, but labour is something that gets socially regulated in many parts of life. We need to think about it with multiple dimensions. And that, I'm going to propose to you, helps us to understand the debates about labour and inequality in energy transition. Let's look at the global labour market for a moment. The current situation for workers across the globe is difficult in some important respects. In the context of the pandemic, we've had a rise in unemployment and rise in poverty rates. The low and middle income countries are most impacted by the labour impacts of the pandemic we're living through. Trying to arrest or stop the impacts of unemployment is very difficult, particularly where employment is informal, where those institutions for protections for workers are not well built up, where people are daily workers paid on a piece rate rather than with a salary and a contract. So globally, there is a big discussion about poor work conditions or precarious work. There's also a discussion in the context of the pandemic of greater impairment on women's work, that they are carrying the burden of a lot more unpaid work as households experience financial stress in the pandemic. So I'm raising this issue because the whole workforces across the world are experiencing increased labour inequalities, and this is related to problems of poverty and precariousness in employment. Going to the specific energy sectors, the first problem is about transitioning existing fossil fuel workers. The worries there are that we could end up with surprise mass redundancies and a workforce that has skills that are difficult to translate into new industries. difficult to translate into renewable energy work. For instance, in Australia, most coal-fired power station workers are of an older generation. They often don't have university training. They have good salaries because they work for a public sector organisation or a private corporation. But because their qualifications are different to other industries offering similar salaries, they're unlikely to get a job as good quality with as good pay once a coal-fired power plant is closed. So we've got a mismatch in skills. There are difficulties allocating them to new parts of the workforce. And that means a lot to an individual person and to their family and community. The social science demonstrates that there are psychological and social effects of being unemployed, of losing your job. And when a whole facility like a coal-fired power plant is closed, the losses of a job to multiple workers spreads to the local economy. So for very good reasons, political reasons, workers and their representatives in trade unions and other groups have an interest in lobbying to avoid job losses. And if that can't be stopped, they want to lobby for other compensation packages to help them deal with what they fear, which is a loss of salary and an inability to take their skills elsewhere. This concern for impacted coal workers, as someone mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, was what motivated the trade union movement to start talking about just transition. This is a report from the International Trade Union Confederation that represents the labour movement on energy transition. And you can see that their primary concern is to say we need to respect the contribution of those workers in fossil fuel industries and invest in renewing their local economies in order to help them avoid the personal and local economic losses. And so plans need to be developed in order to formalise opportunities for the people impacted by coal closures. And then on the other side, we have a workforce transition involving a big infrastructure build. The transition to solar and wind and other renewable energies involves new types of jobs. And as I mentioned before, some of these jobs are still extractive. They begin with mining precious metals, for instance, and that we still need coal for the steel that goes into wind farms. Some of the issues for renewable energy workforces relate to that, but also the hazards that can go with manufacturing. Some of the concerns are that chemical exposure or poor factory conditions can be unfair to renewable energy workers. There are debates in Australia also about the construction teams employed on renewable energy projects. Most of these are temporary workers. It's not high paid work. It's actually what gets called low skilled or lower skilled work, mostly holiday visas or temporary migrant workers in the country engaged to do that work. It's not the kind of work former coal-fired power station workers want either. There's also a debate about whether renewable energy offers employers that aren't as good as the ones in the fossil fuel sector. Renewable energy is largely privately owned and run, and so we might be looking at a loss in public sector employment with better conditions and pay. Finally, there's an emerging literature on the household work of producing energy on your rooftop, where you're both a consumer and a producer, managing your relationship to the electricity market, because you own a tiny bit of the grid on your roof, and that involves work and I suppose an advantage for people who have homes that can contribute in that way. So a lot of these things are still in play and being documented by different social scientists across the world. A lot of people ask me about the employment opportunities and the employment effects in renewable energy directly, as well as indirectly. There's been some studies of this. This study of employment factors for renewable energy shows that we can measure both the direct and indirect jobs created per megawatt hour of energy being installed. And the estimates come in a range from, for instance, the medium range of 1 job per megawatt hour of wind, 2.5 jobs per megawatt hour of rooftop solar on your home, or 1.5 jobs per megawatt hour of a concentrated solar plant or solar farm. So they're not very job intensive per megawatt hour, although the installation temporary work is considerable. I also often get asked, are there estimates for how renewable energy compares to fossil fuels? So this study of employment creation in Europe gives you a bit of a sense of what's going on. So there's an estimate that per gigawatt hour of coal, 0.58 jobs are created, mostly in mining. A similar number of jobs are produced in solar PV, but most of this is in installing solar panels on roofs. There are less jobs created per gigawatt hour in wind energy, utility wind, compared to solar. And of course, you've got other comparisons there of nuclear and hydro. So solar PV, putting solar on people's roofs can generate quite a bit of employment, particularly in installing, not necessarily maintaining, but it's not. But wind is not very employment intensive, particularly in the long run. I'm going to give you some examples from Australia to illustrate this on the local level shortly. The other Labor issue I wanted to say a little bit more on before we have a break is that energy transitions, particularly in developing nations, also raise important gender issues. Labour markets tend to be segmented or divided in terms of gender. There are whole industries that tend to have more men in them, and industries that have more women. So the energy sector has historically been overrepresented by men, whereas the health and social services sectors have a lot more women in them as teachers and nurses and so on. What's interesting in the energy space is that there is potentially scope for more participation in energy work by women. And there could be some flow-on benefits for women who can get more self-esteem or confidence, potentially more financial independence by participating in this industry. But of course, the barriers to that include gender dimensions of skills and education, unequal distribution of housework and care responsibilities can also hold women back from participating in energy work in the formal sector. And of course, there can be a gender burden in the unpaid work of collecting fuel and dealing with heating and so on at the household level. Sticking with the formal labour market opportunities for women for a moment, this chart shows that when we think about the technology sector, so the science, technology, engineering and manufacturing sector, there are more men than women, okay? There are an estimated 28% of women in STEM jobs, science, technology and engineering, compared to 35% in the non-STEM jobs that are technical in the world. Further, within these industries, women tend to concentrate in administrative work. So there's discussion about how to encourage and train more women to take up the technical jobs, the technology jobs, because they attract the higher pay and better conditions than lower ranked non-technical or administrative jobs. And now shifting to the household and gender issues, particularly rural households in developing countries, we can see that energy work, collecting food and fuel for cooking, you know, in the local forest or on fields in terms of biomass, takes up an enormous amount of time for women who do the larger amount of unpaid work in households. So there are feminist social scientists who talk about energy issues as a crisis of women's time, and that introducing new renewable energy technology provides a potential opportunity for women to free up their time, to not have to do so much repetitive labor-intensive work. Solar cooking stoves, for instance, can be really an important technology to benefit women in rural households in particular. So wrapping this up, I've proposed that we can think about labour issues in multiple dimensions in terms of our institutions and our relationships and how we're educated and what skills we have. And that all goes into the markets for labour that are impacted by energy transition. We're going to get a little bit more specific about the geography of this shortly, because what's going on for the individual workers and their communities is about regional economic change. It's about that question of where these workers are in the geography of energy. Are they in cities installing solar on rooftops, or are they in a new rural area that's never hosted electricity before? Do we need people to move to new places in order to work on the energy transition? These are important questions. And in terms of the gender perspectives on energy labour, I think it's important to connect the issues in the formal economy and questions about getting good jobs going in energy there, but also in the informal household economy as well, because there's a potential role for new green technologies to benefit women as a group as we undertake an energy transition. I'm going to leave my presentation there and give you, how about a 7-minute break? And then we'll come back and talk about where policy discussions are up to, and I'll show you a little bit more of the evidence from Australia on these issues. So let's come back at 2:10. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Beck. I hope everyone can hear me again now.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So yeah, we'll have a quick break for 7 minutes, and convene back here after that.
Nicole, do you want to pause the recording so people can skip the parts in lieu of the need in favour of wind and solar energy, and to a lesser extent hydro. So I won't go too much into all the ins and outs, but basically the firm decided to close. It wasn't planned, that decision, and in a short amount of time, different levels of government came together to deal with these workforce issues that we've been reflecting on today, to deal with the problems for affected workers who are worried they won't be able to get a good outcome, a good job similar to the one that they're doing, given their skills were learned on the job, not in the formal education system. They're not going to go and get the same kind of salary in another profession, was their worry. So the package that was developed by both the state and federal government put a considerable amount of money into counselling and retraining those workers. It also set up an independent authority for the region to collaborate and decide on an appropriate transition strategy. So this is a very important example of coming together, bringing workers and their representatives together with industry and different levels of government to figure out an independent strategy for dealing with the economic loss of the power station and mining as well. There was money put into establishing other types of economic growth to encourage businesses to come to the Hunter Valley, to spark more economic opportunities in replacement of the coal-fired power station and mines. And of course, for those affected workers, there was a redundancy scheme, particularly focused on older workers who were near retirement age, so they could be compensated and not have to worry about trying to retrain when they're in their 60s and so on. And there was public investment in rail line and other industries to try to get, I suppose, a public sector alternative as well. Now, while this example wasn't the full ideal, there wasn't a government-led plan, it's now understood as one of the best examples of a package to help a local group of workers and their community restructure their local economy and reach other opportunities in relatively similar industries. There's currently a review going on about the outcomes of that in Victorian Parliament, which will be interesting to watch in coming years. The other examples I wanted to share come from research my colleagues and I just published today. On the other side of this transition, looking at rural communities that are beginning to host new wind and solar power plants. They're mostly going in on rural land, and they're involving new economic opportunities, including direct employment and indirect work in rural New South Wales. So what renewable energy planning looks like is the development of what we call renewable energy zones. This image here is a map of solar and wind farms going into what we call the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone of New South Wales. So this is on the eastern seaboard of Australia. These zones have been designated by state law, and they arrange for commercial investment in upgrading the grid and getting access to the national electricity market on the behalf of corporations. These zones are also committed to maximising employment opportunities and broader community benefits. My colleagues and I have been very interested to study this to see to what extent is that goal being reached. So how did we go and find out about this? Because it's such a new thing. These renewable energy zones weren't gazetted until last year, although they have been in development for some years before that. What we did was took a number of field trips, an anthropologist and I, and a policy analyst at an economic think tank, went out to the rural towns and the rural villages where new solar and wind farms were being installed. And we wanted to ask, what does this change mean for you? What economic opportunities and what economic concerns do you have? We went to the Central West and also to this area called the New England Renewable Energy Zone, which is northwest of Sydney in New South Wales. Again, big wind and solar farms being installed. You can see them on the green and purple dots here. And we went and visited people who were hosting wind farms, who worked at the wind farms and solar farms. We talked to workers in town as well, people who run hotels and pubs and other businesses who see themselves as potentially impacted by or benefiting from the new renewable energy projects. This is us on one of the wind farms outside of a place called Glen Innes. So we were interested in lots of social changes, but work came up in an important way. So constructing these big new power plants on rural land is a kind of boom in employment. For the most part, it means temporary workers, migrant workers coming into rural towns, staying in the local hotels or staying all together in a hall that they've rented out for a number of months. So this quote at the top has someone observing, there are so many incredible large deliveries passing through town that the State Highway Patrol has booked 4 rooms for the duration of construction. So this is actually from a newspaper report. So local people see that renewable energy can bring indirect economic opportunity. That's more work to do and more income for the local hotels. It's a 10% lift in business, the temporary work visitors to this town. The second quote here talks about what the renewable energy firms were getting right. So this town worker says that the energy companies were keen to get a good name for themselves. The workers fill their vehicles in town with petrol before they leave. They are told to use local caterers. The renewable energy companies sponsoring local activities and things like that. So when it goes well, the new renewable energy companies are using their workers to create demand for services in nearby towns, and directly investing or contracting local businesses, whether they're caterers or potentially industrial services. So this final quote is from a local council officer, so someone in the local government, saying that they had a role in trying to encourage local business to go out and gear up for the new work. And some did have capacity to do that. And he talked about a local crane hire firm that was able to take the opportunity of the new wind farms, invest in new new machinery, so they could expand and start servicing the wind farms being developed in the New England Renewable Energy Zone with their crane services. There are other things that local councils encourage local business owners to do, like develop the quarry work for the wind farms and so on. So our findings in general with regards to renewable energy is that it's a big commercial development, and like all commercial developments, it creates uneven opportunities. Not everyone was winning. Landholders stood to get the most direct individual benefit, but there were significant benefits flowing from even the temporary workers in town to the local businesses. And dealing with a sense of that unevenness is one of the things we're in conversation about in Australia, how to make those benefits more widely shared amongst the local community. In a nutshell, the construction phase is the biggest economic shock and stream of benefits to the local community, both in terms of direct and indirect employment. As I mentioned, for landholders, there's very good income that can be earned from hosting a new renewable energy facility. There's also disagreement amongst landholders, particularly where neighbours miss out on the rent from hosting the renewable energy facility. There can be a sense of missing out. We also observe that these renewable energy zones in Australia have a much higher proportion of First Nations, Indigenous people residing in them compared to the average Australian postcode. And we felt that there was a lot more work to do to consult with Indigenous people and to find ways to share the economic opportunities with that group, because they can be left on the sidelines at the margins of this big renewable energy boom. Our report, and I can put a link to that in the chat, concludes that we really need very careful coordination of the timing of the renewable energy build, to make sure that renewable energy construction doesn't displace economic activity like tourism, and to make sure that the timing helps local businesses take up the opportunities, like that crane driver I met. So we need every level of government involved, and in particular we need the local councils and local community groups to be able to feed into the planning of renewable energy, because they know best, you know, what their needs are. But of course we need the national government and the state government to really coordinate the investment in new energy infrastructure as a whole. So to conclude on those two examples before I go to policy, these changes, whether we're talking about closing an industry or building up a new one, they're industrial. And so they really do involve work. And that sits at some of the main issues that get debated in the social transition that you're going to discuss more broadly again with Beck next week. It's a rural transition as well. In the state that I've been researching, we can see that renewable energy is rolling out in new areas of rural Australia that have existing issues of inequality and some unemployment issues and so on. And so there's a real opportunity as well as a challenge to make sure participation can benefit those most in need, whether it's people facing underemployment or unemployment, or Indigenous people and so on. The other thing to conclude here with regards to renewable energy is that direct employment in renewable energy isn't enough for sustainable development. The employment effects are significant, but not huge. They don't actually compare to a coal mine, particularly for local towns like the ones I visited, and I suspect like the ones in the nations you work in. So we need to be careful about overemphasizing employment opportunities in renewable energy. They don't easily replace coal-fired power workforce issues. And I think that leads us to conclude that we need a broader industrial strategy to encourage what often gets called green jobs. Now, I'm going to spend just a few more minutes, if you don't mind, summarising the policy best practice in the literature, and then I'm keen to hear from you on your perspectives on these issues. So, excuse me while I come back here. So, where is the policy debate over best practice for industrial policy and energy transition? There is a very, I suppose, established recognition of the idea of a just transition that we started this session reflecting on. It's mentioned, for instance, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreement at Paris in 2015. There's not a clause or commitment, but there are words to the effect of a just transition of the workforce and creation of decent work, quality jobs is important in developing priorities for national development priorities reporting to the UN on climate policy. The International Labour Organization has many documents like this setting out principles for guiding transition to environmentally sustainable industries. And there's usually focus on building consensus and including lots of different stakeholders, particularly those representing workers. I think in terms of the broad industrial strategy that I mentioned earlier, there are 4 main emphases. One is that the just transition for the fossil fuel workforce. The second one is about making sure decent work is created. The third one is a bit bigger, economic diversification, going beyond renewable energy and encouraging other types of industry. Most debates about energy transition end up being about the local economy in general, and what people want for it and for themselves. And of course, gender equality is part of the best practice policy information out there. So the examples like the Hazelwood power station I mentioned earlier, those case studies are written up in the literature and end up emphasising the importance of long-term planning, avoiding a situation where the company decides ahead of the government. And that relies on consultation, a good independent authority that brings different stakeholders in to help make decisions, as well as public funds for transition arrangements. So the funds are used to help with skill development and retraining, as well as broader economic diversification goals, which is one of the broader points that I want to emphasize here, that if there's enough diversity of opportunity, people can feel and find confidence in going forward and shifting how they work. So pre-transition, the best thing to do is to establish a timeline for decarbonisation and be in dialogue with affected people, create plans for low carbon industry at every level, compensate workers with retraining and re-employment opportunities, and provide financial incentives, and invest in the community. Oops. Sorry. To get that going on a broader level, we need active labour market policies to encourage industries to develop good, decent work that rely on high-skilled workers and give opportunities for training and so on in order to participate in the best quality jobs possible. So employment services are important here. Engaging education institutions are important as well. Both in terms of formal education and education being trained on the job. Sorry. And this really comes under the banner of the International Labour Organisation's Decent Work Agenda, which has now been recognised in the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So I'm really just echoing the established, I suppose, policy proposals out there. On economic diversification, one of the main reason why it's important to go beyond renewable energy is that in terms of operation and maintenance, it's not very labour intensive unless you're talking about rooftop solar. Particularly in areas of Southeast Asia, you're talking about rural economies with strong agricultural focus. So economic diversification means encouraging industries that can give people work beyond the farm, formal employment that might be about value adding into agricultural products, manufacturing food, and so on. Developing food product markets is the main, is one of the focuses, for instance, for people who work on food and just transition. And that means, again, regional development strategies for rural areas. The UNEP has some interesting work out there on a Green New Deal and as well as on economic diversification for rural communities. And that final point on gender equality comes back to policy that can encourage women into the energy sector and address the overrepresentation of men in the technical professions. So here the policies needed affirmative action policies to encourage women and girls to nominate themselves for work in this sector. It also involves active institutional reform to help retain women, particularly as they become parents across the life course. So providing childcare and so on can be very helpful, and flexible work arrangements to help women stay in that employment over the course of their careers. So there's a lot of social science literature out there about changing our workplaces so they're more friendly to women, so they can reap the benefits of a green economy. And I've already mentioned what green technologies can do in rural households as well. There's an International Renewable Energy Agency report out a couple of years ago, 5 years ago now actually, looking at energy policy options to deal with gender inequality that you might be interested in. But the overall theme here is a social dialogue, long-term planning, cooperating with stakeholders to address any conflicts before they happen, particularly between business and trade unions and other community members. When it comes to talking about green jobs, it's important to have a broad strategy and go beyond just renewable energy, to work with people to diversify their economy and provide equitable opportunities. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, but I'm also very keen to hear your reflections on where any of this material resonates with you. Does it make sense? Are you looking at similar issues, or are your issues somewhat different? I'm very keen to hear.
Okay, so as before, everyone, just you can use the chat box or raise your hand and we can unmute you to talk. Beck, I've got one question while we're waiting. You mentioned, you talked a little bit about how employment, there can be employment for people in new renewable energy zones, especially in the construction phase, and that for some landholders, there can also be rent from hosting the project on their site. In any of the renewable energy zones that you looked at, is there any involvement of the community in the ownership of the renewable energy project, so that they're actually like a part of the ownership structure, part of the investment structure for the project?
Yeah. The short answer is almost no. Okay, and it's interesting that this is your question, because we just launched our report, and it was the question that people wanted answered as well. The renewable energy zones in Australia are mostly corporate run, big scale energy installations on private land. There are, however, initiatives that people have got together over to own and run their own batteries, as well as wind and solar facilities. There's actually a community wind farm in Victoria called Hepburn Wind Farm that actually precedes renewable energy zones. And in one of the renewable energy zones we went to in New England, we met people who had tried to get something similar going in the highlands of New England, and they were unsuccessful, in part because they couldn't compete. They couldn't generate the capital they needed to develop a viable commercial project. So there's a long way to go in terms of giving people an opportunity to run renewable energy as a community. There is a discussion in Australia about that. There are advocates for community energy, and the current federal government has committed to community batteries, funding for that. And I think what we'll see is an evolving kind of discussion about more projects like the Hepburn Wind Farm, because there are people whose imaginations have been captured by the energy transition, and they want to be, they want, you know, more ownership and control than is currently out there. Anyone else have a comment or? Nicole reminded me of a question earlier from someone about the Ministry of Manpower in Australia. We have a Ministry of Employment. Let me just go and check the exact name of it, because we just had a change of government. We have a minister for something like employment and industrial relations, and that minister in Australia, Tony Burke, oversees the formal wage setting process for most employees in the country. We have something called an award system for all the major sectors in the Australian economy, and that the award defines the core salaries and conditions and rights that workers have in different sectors: nursing, education, construction, mining, the public sector, and so on. We also have a parallel system of enterprise bargaining, which has been in place for 30 years or so. It was negotiated by a Labor government in the 80s. And enterprise bargaining, it covers about 15%, I think, of the workforce. And what it involves is trade unions at a workplace level negotiating with employers over salaries, conditions, rights, types of leave, all that kind of stuff. So in universities, our trade union representatives negotiate with the executives of our universities for a new enterprise agreement every 3 to 4 years. And most enterprise agreements generate better pay and better conditions than the award. We're paid about 30% more than what we would be if we were employed under the award. And we have many more entitlements to leave and work health and safety protections and so on. There's also general legislation that governs workplace risk that the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations is responsible for. And we have a system to deal with disputes between employers. So I would imagine in many of the nations you work in, there might be something similar. Sometimes those industry and workplace relations portfolios are woven into education as well, because obviously education shapes the workforce, but we separate them presently.
Okay, one question has come in back about geothermal. So speaking about geothermal energy in Indonesia, we are trying to maximize the benefit of geothermal projects by developing many geothermal direct use applications so that nearby community can get more benefit, more job, businesses, opportunities outside the geothermal power plants.
Yes.
Okay, so that's it.
I think that's great news, Olia. I gave a presentation on the renewable energy zones to public servants in the federal government a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this, that installing low carbon electricity, in your case geothermal, in ours wind and solar, provides an opportunity to develop parallel industries which can employ people. Because if you've got access to cheap, low carbon energy, then you potentially have a site that could host more industrial development and more opportunity for future workers. So that fits under this agenda for economic diversification, in my view. So thinking beyond renewable energy, what other kinds of industry can be built for people to give them social chances, to improve their incomes and so on. I think that's a great story, and I hope that it's successful.
Okay, there's a question about the experience in Australia in dealing with the social friction that may be caused by the inflow of external labour with the existing local labour.
Yeah. I don't think there was a lot of really, how do I put it, really contentious debate in our field areas, in part because there wasn't a sense that temporary workers constructing wind and solar farms had jobs that local people wanted. Many of the smaller towns we visited didn't have enough people to take up those jobs. So there wasn't very contentious debate. However, I did have a group discussion with a mayor of a local council and a local business owner who ran a solar installation firm. And the discussion there was around the training issue, that in their town there was an issue of unemployment and underemployment, and those people, are experiencing social disadvantage, and they need a lot more support to get the qualifications needed to even do the construction work. And so they needed public investment in the local TAFE and basically employment services well ahead of time to get people to a point where they could participate in that work. But again, even if they did all of that, there wouldn't be enough local workers for the build. So most energy firms employ a contractor who employs a group of temporary workers to move across the landscape. I think it could become a big debate, particularly where renewable energy is going to be installed in coal mining regions. So that could be happening over the next 10 years. There are new renewable energy zones defined in an area called the Hunter Valley, where most of our coal mining is in New South Wales. And if there's a sense that these jobs are being missed out on, we might see more debate or conflict there.
Great. It would be interesting to hear from any colleagues like Pak Kristianto or anyone in Indonesia if it is an issue in the renewable energy projects that you see coming up in Indonesia. Okay, so there's a question here relating.
Kristianto has his hand up.
Okay, can we unmute the mic for Pak Kristianto?
Okay, thank you. The reason I was asking this because for Indonesia, from my personal point of view, if we want to go for I don't know, a nationwide renewable energy plan, it will require a great amount of foreign direct investment. Yes. The thing is, if we invite foreign direct investment, the investor will majorly using their own national employees, and that have caused many social friction here in Indonesia. We are dealing with in nickel mining, where the nickel is the nickel workers majorly was used from foreign employees, but then the local employees were not part of the major labor that were used by the investors. So that's why I can sense there will be challenges for Indonesia, especially if you want to go to that path. Yeah, I think that you're right to I suppose be concerned or be thinking in that direction. It reminds me more of our mining sector debates from time to time, particularly the remote mining firms have argued for the right to be able to hire temporary migrant workers to some success, but in areas on the eastern seaboard, the trade union has resisted that, and most people need to have a more standard, at least longer term visa to work in the industry, and most of the workforce is Australian, to my understanding. Yeah, I think it's a big consideration, and it connects to the corporate ownership question I see down here as well, Tarek. I think it's really clear that renewable energy transition is extending private corporate electricity, and we in our report look at the parent companies of all the new firms moving into New South Wales, where we were looking, and the picture is all private firms, and the wind farms are mostly developed by European-based multinationals as well as some Chinese firms. Australian solar farms, however, were a mix of international firms and Australian smaller firms, which is interesting. The main point we're making about that at the moment is, with all these new corporate entities, you get lots of different practices. Some of them are very good corporate citizens. Some of them are less diligent about how they relate to the local community, how much effort they put into engaging local businesses and so on. And panel I was just on when we launched our report saw a rural politician and a number of people in the audience unhappy about the foreign ownership dimension of renewable energy. There are parallel debates about this in agriculture and mining as well. So it's familiar. I do think that renewable energy transition is extending a privatized model of electricity.
Okay, we're coming up to 5 minutes left for time. So is there any final question from anybody? Anyone wants to raise their hand? Oh, great. And Beck has just shared the report in the chat box there, so you can read the details there. Okay, maybe we'll pass over to you, Tang.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, hi, Tang.
Hi. Thanks, Beck and Tarek, for very interesting session. I guess that the session has opened up many ideas for us to think about. The labor issue in energy transition is important and varies across the countries, because I guess that it depends a lot on the social, cultural, and economic contexts.
Yes.
So the interventions from the participants are very helpful, and I encourage you to continue the discussion in the Moodle course website. Go there and put your comments and questions there, and I'm sure that Beck would be happy to follow and answer any questions you may have later. So thanks again, Beck, for a very interesting and inspiring session, and thanks, Tarek, for effective facilitation as always. So everyone, this is a nice session, and next session in 2 weeks' time will be our last session in the training component, right? After that, we will have a series of policy deep dives, and you are welcome to participate. But in terms of the training, this is the second to the last. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the final one on social issue of energy transition. And after that, you will be writing an essay, as I mentioned in the last session, and also Tien in her email yesterday mentioned in detail about the requirement of the final essay. So you can start preparing for it now. We will open the link for you to submit on the course website in 2 weeks' time. And in the final session, we will have some time for you to ask questions about that final essay. Until then, all the best and enjoy your day, the rest of your day. And thanks again, everyone, for participating very effectively and actively today. And bye for now.